Indy, I'm really excited about this collaboration between Future of Good and Dark Matter Labs on really in-depth, nuanced conversations on the fragility of our future. The invitation, and I think the starting point, at least from my perspective, is, we're at a point in time where never before has humanity been pressed to navigate and grapple with our responsibility for our future. And I think that's really uniquely important, I think, as a point in time. And our, the narratives that are part of our social fabrics, our organizations, our communities, our neighborhoods, etc. We really have the power to massively improve the human and planetary condition, but we also have the power to inflict harm well into a time we can't see or feel. And today, it really, really feels like we have a future that is more fragile than ever. So in this conversation, I'd love for us to really dive into the multidimensional nature of the fragility we're all living and experiencing. And maybe perhaps we could begin with this and see where the conversation takes us. But what does fragility mean, right? And I can kick us off here. One of the ways that I'd characterize fragility is through care. And every crisis, whether it's local or global, regional, etc., from the sort of the big COVID-19 pandemic to some of the more regional droughts that are experienced in many parts of Europe right now. These are all instances in my mind that illustrate the systemic negligence of care. And I don't mean care in a sort of a superficial policy or institutional kind of way, but I mean in a way that deeply embeds care in who we are as a humanity, right? Like the deep care for the humanity of a person, a deep care for the dignity of the natural world, the deep care for the relationships we have, a deep care for the obligations we carry as a species. So there really seems to be, in my mind, a fast-growing disconnect around the notions of care that we hold, and it's so interesting because we've just gone through a global pandemic where never before has care appeared in our conversation. So with families, with in schools, in organizations, workplaces, etc. But yet we can't put our finger on it. We can't put our finger on it, and we don't fully understand the complexity and the fragility of care right now. So I want to maybe kind of use that as a bit of a launch point and see what you think about it, and take us in other directions too.
Firstly, delighted to be here and delighted to kind of be extending this relationship as well, Vinod. So I think maybe I like your framing of care, and maybe the first thing I'd say is that I think the extension of care that we need the reason why we need to extend our theory of care is that the anthropogenic effects of our living systems are now able to massively distort our futures. So I think the anthropomorphic capacity of what we've built has massive distortive effects on futures. Now, historically, I'm not sure that was the case, in a sense. I think civilizations' imprint on futures, in terms of actually ecological futures, our wider biosphere, were relatively insignificant to the ecological effects of the system itself. So our ability to impact our ecological base foundational footprints was not the same. Yes, we would have contingent effects on future generations, But even then, I think our impact on future generations wasn't at the systemic level of carrying capacity of the planet, the kind of the pollution systems. They weren't systemic level sort of effects. So we've reached a point of civilization where our impacts are now cascading in time and space, and are no longer bounded either in the country logic or the land logic alone, or the kind of territory logic, nor are they bounded in time into a presentism that we're obsessed by. And I think the challenge that this is rooted in is our theory of governance doesn't expand either through the territory, outside the territory of a nation state. It does, there are mechanisms, but they're few and far between. They're usually, and it doesn't extend through time either. So our landscape, our institutional frameworks for care don't exist. And thereby that lack of institutional frameworks has meant that there's been a systemic incentivization for externalization, either to the future or externalization outside territories. And those externalizations are now self-terminating us. So to reframe that as a careless behavior without care frame, both in terms of space and time, I think is a very, very significant moment. And I think the challenge for us is to recognize that we are now operating in a level of capacity that we have exponential effects into the future and exponential effects into adjacent systems to the point that they're terminating. And that demands, as you rightly say, a new relationship of care. So I would say that we've exceeded, our capabilities have been exceeded. Now, the other point that I would say is the capabilities in which, these capabilities that we've been building have been built on stocks of energy. Those stocks of energy, 65 million years old stocks of energy, that we've been using to effectively create this kind of capacity. And the kind of really interesting question is, how do we deal with moving from those stocks of energy to new flows of energy, i.e. some form of kind of persistent flow energy system as opposed to depleting those stocks? And how do we do that without actually massively increasing our pollution landscape? And that, I think, is a very structural transformation that's required. And I think what we have to talk about is a systemic energy transformation of our civilization. And to be able to, and now you could argue, taking the long view in history, that the only way to get to this tipping point of capability, we needed to use those stocks of energy to generate into a new energy flow landscape and to be able to actually harness 500 billion unit worths of human energy from equivalent to human unit worth of energy in a completely different way. Now, just to be clear, we're nowhere close, right? We're nowhere close to being able to make 500 billion human unit worths of annual energy, not from hydrocarbons, but from renewables. We're nowhere close. Since 2019, 2020, the global energy increase was greater than all the installed renewables, right? So we're like miles away from what that civilization transition. The unfortunate problem we've got is our time window is running out. We no longer have decades to be able to make such transitions. We have maybe a few decades to make those transitions. So I think, and at that moment in time, as our energy systems become constrained, do we as a civilization, remember, energy constraints then drive self-corruption. So what we're seeing, I would argue, is a systemic corruption in order to maintain status quo, to be able to offload those externalities. We've been offloading those. So there's a kind of question, do we have the integrous pathways to be able to make this energy transition, which is the fundamental, and also the derivative economies of that energy transition, also making those transitions? And do we have the integrity in the system left to be able to make that transition? And can we do that through a non-competitive landscape? Because the other thing that we need to put on the table is that we have to be able to make this transition without falling into mutually assured destruction. Because actually, if we fall into any form of kind of, and there are many conversations going on, unfortunately, about how the carrying capacity of the planet is 1 billion people and how do we get to 1 billion people. I think this is a dead-end story, literally, for all of civilization. Because if we permit that level of, I would say permit, because it's going to be a system level effect. If we permit that level of war, that level of starvation in the system, the level of trauma we will unleash into the world will be non-containable, and we will release the language of war and terror that will terminate us. So we have to make this transition, not by falling into mutually assured destruction, but mutually assured thriving. How do you do that in a new constraint landscapes? Because remember, the energy systems control our material economy, control our food systems, which are all endothermic right now. Vast amounts of energy inputs are required to maintain our food systems. Our material economy is literally one-to-one linked almost to our hydrocarbon energy. We don't have the density of energy to be able to mine materials using anything other than hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are the densest. I think someone said in equivalent terms, hydrocarbons are like steak, and renewables are a little bit like lettuce. To get in terms of kind of equivalence of.
Wait, I thought it was more alt meat. No,
it was alt meat, beyond meat. But I think the analogy is very poor, because the energy it takes to consume meat is actually very high. But in kind of the superficial kind of comprehension terms, it sort of gives the density of energy available in the system is extraordinarily varied.
Right. I want to make a sort of a few connect a few dots here, because and it relates to something that you said around, you know, the systemic energy transformation and our material economy. But you know, there's sort of like two paths I want to sort of like explore with you. One is, I'm really curious about our material consumption and the growth of our material consumption. And you know, I read some really interesting longitudinal research by Nick Kausch the other day that sort of, you know, tracks material consumption levels since the 1950s. And what was really interesting, one of the interesting things about that research was, you know, he sort of said, if we maintain the same material consumption levels in the 1950s, we would only need to work 11-hour work week today. And so that's fascinating for me. But you know, there's no question about the energy transformation work that's happening. No question about, you know, there's lots of some nuanced, lots of not so nuanced conversations about a green transition that are happening all over the place. But it doesn't, like, the equation seems incomplete to me. It seems incomplete because, you know, how do you get to a systemic energy transformation, you know, without reimagining material consumption, and dare I even say reducing material consumerism, right? So that feels a bit like combating drug trafficking without reducing drug addiction, you know, like that feels a bit like that. And so, like, and there's this, that's sort of like one pathway. The second pathway is sort of linked to care, because so much of how, you know, how we feel and you know, feeling a sense of fulfillment, feeling a sense of belonging, feeling a sense of connection, feeling a sense of joy. A lot of this stuff, at least in the parts of the world that I live in, are linked to materials. And so is there a decoupling that we would have to wrap our heads around between the feelings of care that have to do with joy and connection and belonging and well-being, decouple that with material consumption, you know, and because that is a real struggle for us. Like, you talk about a sort of a transition, yes, a systemic energy, you know, transformation, but we really need a systemic consumption transformation.
Yeah, totally. So I think global GDP is virtually, there are two countries that are delaminated theoretically from energy and GDP linkages. They are the US and the UK, but in fact, most of that's as a result of the outsourcing of their material consumption to China and other parts of the world. So actually what we have is pretty much a one-to-one alignment between GDP and energy. So what that, and our material stock, right? So that's one thing worth just recognizing. The second thing worth recognizing is that, as you rightly say, the average Swede consumes, I think, 27 tons of matter a year, the average Swede. The global average, I think, is 2 tons of material a year. So there is massive asymmetric consumption. Now, the question about sort of 1950s, the reality is 1950s were pretty horrific still for most of us, right? So the question then becomes is what is the transition, right? So the problem that I think we're now facing is we're facing chasms in our material transitions. So, for example, we don't have, I mean, I know Canada's kind of particularly unique around this, but globally, we don't have the timber supply. We don't have copper systems. We don't have copper supply. We don't have sand. So what we're seeing is, and these are just basics, right? That we're saying, everyone talks about kind of rare earths like cobalt and other things, but actually it's those fundamentals that are vulnerable. So when we start to look at that, is that we are going to have to dematerialize our economy, right? That's a structural move. And we're going to have to dematerialize it in lots of different ways. So we're going to have to massively reduce our material economy. Yes. We're going to have to massively make it bio-based. Yes. We're going to have to massively make it durable. Yes. And we're going to have to build a new intangibles economy. And that's going to have to be at the foundation piece of society in the world. So, for example, a next generation asset, again, we're looking at future generation assets, are going to be the collective intelligence of a city, might be a more powerful asset than real estate. So how do we start to shift what we value? What's the mental health of a city? If you value the mental health of a city as a fundamentally foundational piece of infrastructure, how do you start to talk about tomorrow? And that also means that it's also really important, I think, to go into the deep of our consumerism economy as well. So I think our consumerism economy, I think, has been a function of dealing with a mal-work economy. So I would argue that we have created an economy, a work economy, which is largely largely about suppressing us. I mean, an employment contract, you could argue, is a 21st century extension of slavery, where you suppress all your rights as individuals and democratic agents in return for resources. Now, that violence that constructs, I think, manifests in us expressing ourselves through theories of consumption, which are dopamine level effects of dealing with the violence. I do think our fundamental production work economy has been creating systemic harm to which we're being able to having to fix, and I'd use the word fix in the kind of drug sense of fix those things with malconsumerism, whether it's sugar, whether it's sort of attention economies, whether it's sort of cheap retail economies. These are all psychological fixes to deal with the psychological harm that's constructed in our industrial work economy. And that relationship has produced that systemic relationship between the nature of our work organization and the harm that's generated, which we're trying to fix, or in the old sense, not fix the problem, but get a fix to it. That has now created a feedback cycle where it's transformed what we produce into those addiction economies, as it says. So we've mal-structured our production and our consumption economy in a vicious cycle. So I think breaking that, and I think intuitively people get this, and intuitively this is why we've got whole movements happening around inner development goals and other things happening around the world. And we know there's a kind of new production economy required, and that's going to change the nature of what we consume and how we consume. So I think this is quite a structural transformation at a material level, at a kind of care, complex cognition, creativity level of what our economies look like. And I think this is not a moral transition. It's also a functional transition, because in a complex, contingent world where the human-machine relationship is completely different, I think what we're looking for, human contribution, is going to be focused on sort of empathy. It's going to be focused on different ways of embodied knowledge, those are going to require not extrinsic control mechanisms, but intrinsic incentives. And that requires a different economy and a different economy of production, and a different economy of, and thereby a different economy of what we consume to be able to accelerate those capabilities. So I think we're looking at quite a structural transformation of our economy. And I think it requires us to reimagine all sorts of things like balance sheets and what a balance sheet of society looks like and value looks like, and our theory of assets, our theory of property. All of these things are being unwound and restructured. And I think that's the level of deep work that we need to go into. And we need to talk about structured transitions of our economies to that reality, right? I don't think we are to, we're talking about, little additional, we'll have some social enterprises and we'll have some social businesses and somehow that. This is a structured transformation of pretty much all of the industry of our society from one economy to the next. It's like post-war rebuilding. It's like post-war rebuilding of our economies. And I think we need to see it through that lens. And either we'll see it through that lens or it'll happen to us through what we're seeing. UK is right now in the middle of, what is it, 40% food inflation? 40%, this was, you might as well be talking about sort of one of the kind of, what used to be called banana republics, right? These sort of crazy world scenarios. And we're now seeing that as common parlance between the so-called developed worlds, right? So I think we're into a new economy. And I think what my worry is that it is convenient for politicians to let us all be victims of this rather than actually construct the politics to deal with this.
So there's a few threads here, because I want to sort of get into the not so much the politicians of the new economy, although that's very exciting. And there's some good drama to be had there, but the politics of the new economy, right? And which I think is really interesting. But your points around systemic restructuring of work, of the workforce, the value of work, all of this sort of reminds me a little bit of the good old Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and which we still use to this day to point to the sort of the bottom up. And there's been lots of new variations of Maslow's hierarchy. But what my sort of curiosity in all of this is like you can go up the sort of the chart and sort of go, like, yes, basic needs, shelter, work, purpose, etc., and safety, all of that. But at the very top is self-actualization. And I'm really curious about that, because I think I wonder if there is a fragility around self-actualization. What does it mean today? In the context of the systemic transformations that this current generation and future generations will have to go through. In the context of all the systemic corruptions that you're talking about to maintain the status quo, in the context of dematerializing our economy, all of this, I sort of think about, well, what was self-actualization, and what is the new self-actualization?
Yeah, I mean, there's two things there, right? So one thing is, I think Maslow's hierarchy is based on a theory of individualism, which I think is deeply questionable right now. So I think that's the sort of, I think it's rooted in a theory of individual and in a kind of entangled reality, which is both human, non-human, future humans, future non-humans. Like, I do worry that the theory, as you rightly point out, is self-actualization. It can be made, it's a sort of almost a convenient path to kind of individually sitting on the kind of top of a mountain and somehow being self-actualized. But the reality is we're entangled systems, and no society, you cannot individually do this, and you cannot individually, even if you self-actualize, you can't maintain the safety and security of your other systems without actually the relationality to it. This is why I talk about mutually assured thriving. So I think mutually assured thriving is actually really critical. Mad versus mad, mutually assured destruction, mad versus mad, in a sense that I don't think there can be such mutually, self-actualization. It has to be mutually assured sort of mutually assured realization and self-realization and self-act. So I think the language is problematic because it's rooted in the theory of individuality. And that really goes to the heart of the question, that I think the liberation that the Western economic model did was that actually the divisibility that it constructed in the world was absolutely incredible, because it constructed a thesis of freedom and agency, and it kind of liberated an agency that was extraordinary, that had never existed. Agency both for humans, but also agency of, and the agency also permitted a theory of violence and different new forms of violence. There were historic forms of violence, right? There were kind of entrapments, kind of class orders, which are forms of violence in their own right. There were new theories of violence that were operationalized. Now the question is, as we become more consciously entangled at the individual level, right? How do we deal with that individuality, and how do we construct new theories of freedom and agency to that? And that has to be through a mutually assured thriving framework, because any other form doesn't work. And that then asks the question, what is the equivalent of Maslow's hierarchy at a kind of what I'd call systems level, as opposed to an individual level? And what does that really mean? And I think that's a completely different type of landscape into those frameworks. And I think, we've constructed all sorts of paradigms which are problematic against that.
Right. Yeah. And, part of that too is, around mutually assured thriving, I think a lot about the enormous burden and pressures and reflections and actions that have been underway for some time around injustices of the past, and there's all kinds of them that you can talk about. Here in Canada, we talk about Indigenous reconciliation. We talk about systemic racism. We talk about slavery, like all this type of stuff. And I'm really curious about the relationship between some of this and to what you're saying around mutually assured thriving, because and I feel like the linchpin here, at least one of the linchpins here, is trust. And trust is declining. Trust in institutions are declining, and trust in the people in the institutions are declining. That's primarily why trust in a lot of institutions are declining. And and what's really interesting is that a lot of we're seeing a lot of this because there's been enormous systemic injustices in the past, both by people who work in these institutions, places of power, and the institutions themselves. So, it almost feels like no one is going to trust current institutions to come up with any sort of mutually assured thriving framework, because the fundamental trust in the institution itself is broken and is declining. And so then I really sort of wonder, well, what type of trust is necessary? If that's a key ingredient, what type of trust is necessary in order to realize and actualize some type of a mutually assured thriving framework? Because the reality today is that there is a serious crisis of trust.
Yeah, I suppose obviously what you're saying is absolutely right. There's a way to frame it, I suppose, which I'm interested in, which is maybe trust is declining for good reasons, right? Maybe actually the decline in trust is a natural phenomenon because the institutions to which trust was historically attributed are no longer worthy systemically to carry that trust. And it's not that they do not have the ability to give assurance and to give predictable engagement in the way that trust would be maintained, right? So I wonder whether we shouldn't be lamenting trust, but we should be seeing trust as an indicator that there's something systemically wrong in our institutional frames and structures, that they no longer have the capacity in a complex agent world to be able to carry trust. And whereas at the same time, I would say, it's quite remarkable, whether it's you and me or the networks around the world, there is a new field of trust that operates around the world, around the planet, in new formats, with vast amounts of liquidity of knowledge and other things, and relationships and friendships and other things that are operationalizing in a new landscapes of trust. So I wonder whether the trust is more of a signal, and a signal of a much more structural issue, that our institutional frames are no longer able to create some degree of trustworthiness in a complex emergent world, because they cannot either, their theories of control to which they're built on are no longer deliverable, because you cannot control in a complex emergent world. They can't actually be particular in hypercontextual situations. So there's a kind of a fundamental question of emerging into an entangled landscape, and our instruments of trust are broken and our institutions of trust are broken. That doesn't mean that trust in the whole system is declining. I think there's trust is moving. It's like trust for me is like capital, in a sense, it's moving from one landscape of trust to a different landscape. So, networks of WhatsApp groups are vastly more trusted than some institutions, right? So trust is moving into other landscapes. And I'd much rather see it flowing rather than depleting. And it's depleting from one space to another, which has critical issues.
And, and so this is really interesting, because that, it sort of takes me to legitimacy, because that, I think, now we get into some really interesting sort of legal stuff, which is super fascinating. But just quickly, on this, because it is trending downward. It is trending downward, and I think, in 25, 30, 40 years from now, it is going to get to single digits. and the question for me is, right now in Canada, as an example, only a bit over 40% of Canadians trust government. And so if that gets to single digits in the next 25 to 30 years, which it very well could, because it's trending that way, then yes, love to see trust increasing in new landscapes, and in new types of groups and institutions. But the key piece, though, in here is, could you maintain legitimacy and also operate on single-digit trust?
Legitimacy, perhaps not, but could you operate on single-digit trust? Maybe. I think the kind of underlying question is that I think we're locked into an industrial democratic template which is no longer fit for purpose. And no one has the kind of audacity to say, right, actually, our parliaments no longer work. They're not able to make decisions in the societal decision-making structures. We don't seem to have the kind of self-reflexive capacity to edit at the structural level of our societies. We don't have the code to do that self-editing. In fact, the constitutional reforms are too difficult, so nobody touches them, but we don't have the mechanisms to do the hard graft. And we're so worried that one vested party will get so much power by recoding it in a different way, that we're reluctant to open that box up. So what that's doing is our societal decision-making structures are no longer fit for purpose. They're systemically not fit for purpose. And I think the lack of trust in them is just a function of that. It's a functional reality. And I was having this conversation today where people were saying, let's do futures work, right? And you say, okay, let's do futures work. So if you do decent foresight, how does it relate to modern politicians? How does policy, actual decent, sort of looking at future generations, how does it intersect with any form of legitimacy with modern politicians? Politicians that have gotten a mandate for a present super minority, right? They are funded and supported by super minorities. How do they interact with the needs of future generations? We don't actually have a policy we don't have a contestable landscape for those vested groups, they're all vested groups, to be able to interact transparently with any form of legitimacy to be able to do that. So I don't think we have the right templates for these conversations. We don't have the institutional infrastructures. My deep worry is that there's no real work going on in the structural reform of democracy, right? And there's no real work going on. No one wants to really touch it. And at the same time, if you were to perhaps look at, there's a kind of a structural kind of lauding of democracy. But if you look at it, whether it's Trudeau or whether you look at Boris Johnson, what you have is sort of vested interest prime ministers who've come back into power, right, through familial networks, right? Let's be really honest about that, right? That's not taking anything away from Trudeau, right? But let's look at that. Whereas, and I'm not advocating this, but I think it's worth just us holding this position. President Xi, the guy was living in a cave, right? The social mobility for a party to take someone like that and take him virtually all the top to kind of Chinese politics. And if you look at the theoretical meritocracy of the system, far higher than European political landscapes, which have increasingly been captured by super minority interest groups. So I think we have to have a more radical debate about democracy. And I think we have to be more honest about the systemic capture of democratic systems and our industrial democratic systems not being able to deal with the problems that we're talking about. And I think, I actually think the kind of interest of people's trust declining is just a signal of that systemic issue. So, and this is, we can go into conspiracy theory landscapes, but I think the problem is that we're not dealing with these issues. We're not actually having the conversations to say, what is the future of democracy? And in a landscape where, certainly in the UK, for example, where there is no economic growth, there's kind of actually increasing poverty, and you've got effectively, vested interest groups pretty much controlling, I would argue, our political system in different formats, and we've seen many forms of that, super minority interest groups, and that's pretty much happening everywhere. You've got a system with, do we think, have we built societal agency? And I would say democracy is the increase of societal agency, and I don't think we've built that. Our market system, the inequality in our capital structures, actually all of these concentrations of wealth, they're reducing the market, the functioning of a market itself, which is actually about the distribution of knowledge, capital, and symmetrical information. So most of our institutions are no longer functioning to maximize the agency of society and the inclusion of agency. So, and that's just present agency, let alone future agency,
right?
Let alone future agency. So I wonder, when do we have this debate, right? And so when we talk about trust, I just think, yeah, fair enough, right? Fair enough. And I think we have to have a more honest debate. If we want to be talking about future of democracy, we're going to need radical reform to have any legitimate space to be able to talk about it. And I think that requires us to engage with this landscape properly.
Right. But so yes to all that. But like in my mind, yes, radical reforms to democracy, but it almost feels like we need radical reforms of our legal frameworks and our legal systems, because at the heart of a lot of this democracy, there are laws, and there are courts, and there are Supreme Courts, and there are people who are having debates about whether this is just. And there's an actual, I think the debate that we're not having perhaps is the law just? And I haven't seen that nuance of a debate, because because at the end of the day, yes, democratic reform, but a lot of it also rests on laws and the legality of what people are trying to legitimize. And the challenge that I'm also seeing a little bit is, even though something could have legitimacy, and trust and fundamental trust in how something, a group, an approach, a model, what have you, where does it fall under the law? And so, what is the legal reimagining that's required in order to legitimize these new landscapes that are emerging?
So yes, and let's break it up in different ways, right? So I would argue that actually there's some the law is opening up vast amounts of spaces like ecocide and future representation. I think the legal space is being opened up, and no doubt it can be expanded, I think, but it is opening up. I think so that's one dimension. I do think the legal space is opening up. I do think there's a problem, though, increasingly, that that legal space and being able to operationalize it in a system is really, really world changing. So to be able to operationalize kind of ecocide as a kind of thesis fundamentally changes our material economy, fundamentally changes our resource economies. So these are root level questions that are being opened up in the legal space, though with which we have no recognition of the economic transitions that means. Jobs. So we're going to see vast labor movements now that are going to oppose climate transitions, because there's no framework to deal with the kind of transition of human employment as we currently have it to this new economy. So I think the legal frameworks are increasingly there. I think the problem is increasingly the operationalization of them. And what we're seeing is, unfortunately, we're seeing more and more legal frameworks emerge. But actually our ability to take them into society, for them not to be systemically corrupted at the point of operationalization, isn't there. I think then the third point is that the law is also a kind of a relationship with what I would say culture of how we believe we are. And I don't think we've done the cultural work, the kind of societal development work, to actually create legitimacy for the next landscapes of law. So it's very clear to many, many more brilliant people than me that actually we're at the point of a massive transformation of what it means to be human, right? If we see our humanity in our microbiomes, in our intelligence is not my own, but it's a function of this dialogic capacity. If we see ourselves as epigenetically linked to context, that transforms our theory of justice. It transforms our theory of our idea of self. Maybe we are all they, them. We're all a plurality. We're a multitude. It transforms our recognition of ourselves as spectrums. So the kind of harder question at the back end of it is how do we build the human capital transformative capacities? And the parallel to this would obviously be the Industrial Revolution and the birth of industrial schools, which we're still living in, right? So the kind of 9 to 3 structure was built because it was factories, and it was about building programmability of time. It was all about creating a new class of human in the theory of machines. What we haven't yet done is reimagine what it means to be human in this new hybrid sort of human-machine biological systems worldview. And I think that has to happen in tandem with our theories of law, in tandem with our theories of democracy, in tandem with our theories of what an economy means and kind of our economic structures means. And these are structural transformations. The challenge is nobody's having the honest conversations, and the honest conversations, and nobody wants to have. This is like a philosophical conversation, right? But the reality of this is energy prices, food prices, construction prices, all of these things have gone up, right? So these forces are coming at us, but nobody wants to describe the reality of these forces in the context of what we're starting to see. Energy, sort of the large-scale energy transition we're in the middle of. So I think the problem right now is we're not seeking to describe the reality that's emerging. We're becoming victims of reality because it's easier in a political term to deal with events and to say, well, this is just events, right? As opposed to actually a fundamental failure for us to be able to describe that reality and be proactive against it.
Yeah, and you know, take that a bit further. The nuance that I'll like add there is, you know, this is how it's playing out in Canada, and I don't, you know, imagine it's playing out very similarly in other parts of the world. Is all this sort of transition work that the narrative of the transition is very unidimensional. You know, it's not a multidimensional conversation. It's not a multidimensional narrative. And what I mean by that is, you know, there are regions of this country, including the region where I come from in Atlantic Canada, Nova Scotia, where our identities are wrapped up in the ocean. It's wrapped up in fishing. It's, you know, we've written poems and plays and, you know, named streets and buildings and families, and it is culturally wrapped up in all of that. But we haven't had a nuanced conversation around the cultural transition that needs to happen alongside the economic and the energy transition. There's lots of conversations about reskilling workers and retraining workers, and okay, if you worked on an oil rig, you know, great, you know, now you're going to be installing solar panels. All right, but the cultural transition has not really kind of taken root, and in fact, it's actually gone the other way, because and this is what's kind of, you know, leading to a lot of divisiveness, because there's actual sort of, you know, voices that sort of, you know, name this in a very dangerous way. They actually say things like, oh, you know what, you know, those regions, you know, they do dirty oil. They are dirty oil, right? And so when you say things like that, that is for people who have been in those regions, who've been living in those regions. A lot of these folks have their identities wrapped up in the resources of the natural resources of these regions, and that's a personal attack. I take it as a personal attack on their identities, and so I think there's you know, the nuance that I would sort of add to this is that there is in addition to all this, you know, above the waterline chitter chatter about retraining and reskilling, the below the waterline stuff that has to do with how do you transition identities, how do you do cultural transitions, that's missing.
I would wholeheartedly agree. I think that cultural transition at the level of both how you understand yourself, but also your identity in that system, and what identity even means in that system. And the question is, how do you do it, right? So unfortunately, I don't think these are just cultural projects. Like, you know, this is not a project-based transformation. I think, I think it requires hard work at the level of, the closest I can get to, certainly in a UK context, it's about rebuilding town halls across the UK, right? New forms of public governance at the micro level, and physically rebuilding them, but in a mass participatory sense. Because the act of construction of that civic piece of infrastructure is also a participation in the identity of the future and how we want to co-govern these realities. And I think you have to do that work in new forms of shared goods to be able to make that future, and you've got to start to be able to build that. And that's just one thing. That's not going to be enough by itself. But I think we have to start to talk about these these things in different ways, and look forward in those discourses. But I think you're right. the cultural transformation is critical. Our identity, our relationship with the future. I also think, that there's a sort of, our relationship with the future is fundamentally broken as well. So I would say, since the kind of, if you look at Star Trek onwards, our relationship with the future has become dark. We've become afraid of the future. The future is a landscape of fear. That's a very Western discourse. It's not an Eastern discourse. So if you talk about the same thing through an Eastern perspective, the future is not a dark future. We've constructed a future of fear, and that fear has meant that, and that's sort of that landscape is now manifesting in an auto-poetic sense, because we are now seeing technology through a lens of fear, and we're seeing technology as a weapon, as a tool, as a device in not in a symbiotic sense. So that's also constructing our narratives of technology, our theories of control, extensions of technology as weaponization mechanisms. So we built this kind of dialogic relationship with the future, which I think is deeply problematic. And I think that's also self-terminating, frankly. So the more we become at war with technology, and more we see it from this dark capacity, we will manifest it through the landscapes of fear that we project on it, not the landscapes of opportunity. So we're also in a very particular landscape, and I think that is also material in this transformation of its culture. Our relationship with technology, it has to become not so divisible.
Yeah, and it almost feels like sometimes, just back on Star Trek, it feels like some of the really interesting things that Star Trek, I don't think we took away the really interesting things that Star Trek could actually teach us, right? And that's those are things like how do we relate to one another as a species? What is the value that we bring? What is the purpose of our life? How do we build trust with one another? What is the currency of trust? Like these are the things that, and so yes to all of that. And I think there has been a very dystopian Armageddon-ish type thing. And of course, these are they bleed into the mainstream consciousness because of Hollywood and cinema and all this type of stuff.
But I do think it's a function of a much more systemic issue, which is that if we live in a world of divisibility, so I make myself divisible from the world, the object-subject relationship with technology creates a space. That space also means that I live in a landscape of fear with the other, and that fear means that I either deploy a landscape of control. Now, that means that we end up in this very, very this distance subject-object power relationship. I think is also problematized and created a whole landscape of fear, emergent fear, to which the othering of technology, I think, is problematic. So I think there's something much more structural in what we're witnessing, not just a sort of a modern day phenomenon. It's a kind of deep code which is now manifesting in not all of our relationships with technology, which I think are problematic.
Right, but Indy, do you think like this fear of the future, like this, I'm not so sure that this is a modern phenomenon. Like I think this sort of predates a lot of technologies we have today. I
think this. No, I agree with you. I mean, this was born in sort of, I would argue, this was born through whether it's kind of the Cartesian frameworks, the object-subject perspective. It was born through all sorts of, sort of the Newtonian worldview. So it was constructed in a very particular. The question is those constructs, and remember, there was, that was also built on Arabic thinking and lots of. But the question is, those worldviews have now mainstreamed at a planetary scale, and they've become encoded into our institutional logics, our language logics, our contract logics. So they've become planetary scale effects of how we see the world and operationalizing it. So you're right. I mean, it's taken time for that thing to become so deeply coded into our whole society.
Right. Yeah. And I want to kind of roll back a little bit, because there's a a lot that we've talked about around building new sets of institutions, landscapes, bringing about reforms, etc. And even you mentioned new types of town halls. But I want to like the fundamental question that I have, the fundamental thing that I'm sort of like grappling with, this sort of the like people need to be able to afford life. Like there is a whole affordability of life question here that is so fundamental. You mentioned, energy prices, food prices, housing prices, this is the reality of today. And you draw it out, 10, 15, 20 years from now, stuff can get pretty scary pretty quickly. But there is a real sort of affordability of life question, which we haven't had the conversation on this, because it feels like I speak to people, whether they're in their 20s or their 40s and 50s or their 80s and 90s. They've all seemed to talk about, yes, when we were growing up, there was things that we could afford, and then there were things that we couldn't afford, and there were ways that we thought about, okay, that's something we can't quite afford. How do we make it more affordable? How do we find more affordable alternatives? There's all these kind of things that came about, but the question around affordability of life, that always sort of remained. I mean, it's in a deep crisis today, but that question always remained. And one of the things that I am sort of like really thinking through is like, because it feels like we are perpetually just looking back, just the last 4 generations, and they've all had these questions about the affordability of life. I kind of forecast ahead, and are we going to perpetually be in an affordability crisis? It will just sort of be a different type of affordability crisis? Or can we actually envision perpetual affordability? Where the question of affordability is a non-question. The question of affordability of life is a non-question. This isn't like a UBI, basic income, basic credits. Like I don't think it's like that's a sort of it's not that question. I think it's far more nuanced than that. And I really wonder about, is all of this possible without tackling the affordability of life and answering that question?
So I think, so there's 2 things. I think, firstly, I think you're absolutely right. I think the question is whether we put on the table the affordability of life, or even as a question. I think maybe we need a paradigm shift where the affordability of life should not even be a question. So in a way, your perpetual affordability, I think, has to be the norm to which we're then moving from. I think that all has to sit, and this is why this is a complex transition. We are facing systemic constraints, right? Food is going to become more expensive, has become more expensive. Energy will become more expensive, has become more expensive. Materiality will become more expensive, has become. So, like, systemically, we are driving, we are cannibalizing and driving the middle classes out. We're consuming wealth from the middle classes in the historic model. So in that context, how do we move towards a new theory of value, which isn't trying to rent seek off the fundamentals of life, and what does it mean to live, right? So affordability of life is a good question, because the life part is really important here. Right. Because the question is, we still have to deal with the fact that 27 tons of matter has to come down to 2 tons of matter. So it isn't, how do we deal with bringing down our materiality, revaluing things that are intangible, non-tangible, care, complex cognition, collective intelligence, all these new forms of assets of society. So making those transitions, shifting our dopamine returns from those non-material transitions, shifting our theories of value to those and self-recognition through those new forms of assets. So we're going to have to do all of that. At the same time, I think we have to massively reduce our material needs to be able to actually, and what's the material environment that allows us to create perpetual affordability at the fight of new forms of cognitive abundance and new forms of emotional abundance, new forms of care abundance, new form of embodied abundances. So I think we have to do some really sharp moves between where we are and where we need to get to. And this is going to require these sort of hard transitions of what do we value? How do we socially recognize that value? How do we construct that value framework? How do we shift our material economies into new ways and new behaviors? And that's going to require, I think that does require a new form of human development and human cognition to be able to make some of those transitions as well. So I think this is an entangled problem of multiple parts that has to happen simultaneously. The problem is, I think most people like to have a neat sequence, A plus B plus C, and it's not going to be like that. It's going to be a multi-acted transition.
Right, right. And what's really interesting is that there are some innovations in insurance products, some innovations in savings products that the whole point, is to make the future more affordable, right? Like it's fascinating how the framing goes. Just picking up on this on affordability of life, because as an example, there's an insurance product, where the core assumption is that education is going to be unaffordable. By the time your kids, if they were born today, by the time they get to be 17, 18 years old and finish high school and move on from high school, education is going to be so unaffordable that you either have to get some sort of product to insure against that unaffordability, or you can have savings products that support your child when they reach 17, 18 and finish high school. So, but all of these things, and the really interesting thing here, though, Indy, is that insurance rates are skyrocketing. Like the ability to enter into agreements to save for your future, whether it's your retirement or your children's education, is skyrocketing. And we've thought of these products, as insurance and so on, as a way to protect our future, as a way to make our futures more affordable, whether it's the future of our, of us being in retirement, or a future where our kids are happily, studying at some college or university somewhere. I think, like, my take here is that I think we're perpetuating the question of unaffordability of life, because there is an entire industry and a set of insurance products and savings products that feed that to us. And not only do they feed it to us, but because of all the rates are skyrocketing, it's even more of a dystopian narrative where we said, okay, well, listen, like, look at energy prices today, look at food prices today. It's absolutely impossible for us to even envision a joyful life, a life where we're content, after we decide we want to retire, and so. Like, it feels like we need to completely reimagine insurance and savings, because there is a fundamental flaw in the assumption and the narrative of these products, and in many ways. And these, these industries are multi-trillion-dollar industries around the world, whether it's insurance or savings or the combination of the two, and the two sort of like go hand in hand. But there is a sort of a bit of a commodification and a hedging against future affordability of life. And so, what's your take on the future of insurance from that perspective?
So, I mean, my intuition right now is that, we're seeing this happen in many places already, where the world becomes increasingly uninsurable. The ability to create a financial hedge to increasingly a disaster-driven or a non-predictable, uncertain future becomes very, very difficult. And so I think insurance is going to be a function of the privileged. I think we're going to increase a vast amount of uninsured landscape. We're going to see governments become de facto insurers, so the primary holders of those liabilities. Their capacity to be able to hold that becomes really critical. So I think that's, I think unfortunately that's where we're headed. And remember, if you lose your insurance, you lose your capacity to get a mortgage, and thereby you lose your capacity to be able to borrow. So we're starting to create a systemic ripple, and that's, this is what you and I are discussing here is not fantasy. It's already happened in parts of Canada, in fact. So after the hurricane, we've seen some of these realities manifest in real people's lives. That's already happening. I think this is a landscape that's coming at us at a rate, because I think you can't financially hedge these features. You're going to have to naturally hedge these features, i.e. you're going to have to build the natural adaptation mechanisms to be able to adapt to some of these uncertainties and build new forms of ways of living to be able to deal with them. So I think that kind of natural hedging versus financial hedging, I think, becomes one of the big issues. I do think that, just to go back to one point you said, can we as society afford for your child not to go to school or university? Like, flip the question around the other way, right?
Yeah.
Can we afford them not to go? Right? And what's the impact of that? Right? And I do worry. So it's always worth, can we afford society to be unhealthy?
Right.
What's the cost of that? And I do wonder what, we know, for example, somebody who's homeless actually costs in many sort of, between 38,000 euros to 41,000 euros to the state in non-different ways a year. Right? So frankly, it's cheaper to give them a house. They may not be able to trade the house, they may not be able to sell it, but actually it's cheaper to give them a house, significantly cheaper for a societal level. Right. So I think we've got some weird models in play which we aren't figuring out, because, and I think this is the other point, you think our economies have become increasingly dependent on what I would call foundational industries like housing. They've become dependent on health, they've become dependent on the education system, they've become dependent on these structural industries, energy grids, water grids, because they are fundamentally rent-seeking systems that you can easily seek rent from in perpetuity, because they're so foundational. They're the lowest level of risk profile in terms of actually societal needs of those things. And we've seen that, right? Energy companies this year produced more profits than, they're all in the top 10, right, of the global industries in terms of profit. So we've seen massive price gouging by the industries, and obviously they're justifying it because we need the profits to be able to do the green transition. They will never do the green transition, right? It's not in their vested interest. Loads of good reasons why they will never be part of it, but that's fine. So what we've seen is I think our economies have become, our capital has become fixed on rent-seeking systems, and we're not, and that's become a self-gouging system. It's easier to just seek rent in the system rather than it is to create new value. And I think capital is increasingly, if you want my honest opinion, I think capital is not deployed for additionality of value. Capital capital is actually largely being deployed for rent-seeking systems, which give secure returns without any form of risk. And our theory of using capital for risk has become massively, undermined in many ways. So I do think there's a more structural question in play at the kind of where our capital in societies has been organised. What is it? 68% of UK's wealth, I think, is stored in land and property. Right.
Right. Listen, there's been, like you mentioned, early on, this isn't a moral transition, but I actually wonder if, in some ways, it is, and
no, I don't think it is. I'll be straight. I don't think it is, because I think the choice that we're facing is mutually assured destruction.
Right.
That's not morality. Death is not a moral position. Like, death is like, okay, end of fucking life. So none of us survive. That's my point.
Yeah. But like a lot of this stuff also relates to values, right? Like, and I really, and what I mean by that is that there are human values that can make the future more fragile. And the question that I'm sort of carrying is like, what values will guide the future, right? And there are certain values that have been entrenched. They've been entrenched for, in some cases, decades, in some cases hundreds of years, in some cases thousands of years, right? I think of values around marriage as an example, or values around care for elders, these kinds of things, and even after going through a global pandemic where the systemic negligence around care for our elders was so revealed and became so apparent, it didn't actually, in a very, very small sense, it did, and some folks sort of said, listen, like, this is actually morally wrong, and the institutionalization of our elders, and where lots of folks, are living in long-term care homes, and many folks are isolated, neglected, etc. And but there was a point in time where that was, that was a good value, because it meant independence. It meant a certain level of freedoms. But I think about that, and I kind of go, well, actually, even after we went through the pandemic, that those values around how we feel toward our elderly population, it actually hasn't changed all that much, and it in fact became more entrenched. there are more long-term care homes that are getting built that don't actually look and feel any different than ones that were built before the pandemic. So the question for me is, like, how locked in are we already? Because these, some of these values are very unlikely to change in the future, or are they? Because I think there is a fragility around the lock-in of these types of, I don't want to say bad values, but maybe bad values, or immoral values, however you want to sort of, careless values, right? I think there is a fragility around all that, but this is what, in many ways, this is what created the mess to begin with. So, but we haven't learned from it, and there continues to be a lock-in of these types of values. So, so in your mind, when you say, okay, it's not a moral problem, but then I sort of wonder, well, listen, like, there are going to be some values that guide the future, and the question is, which values will guide the future?
So maybe I pass the problem slightly differently. So I think morals and moral landscapes are powerful in helping us explore new values and advance value that is tacit in the system, right? It's tacit, unexplored, uncodified in the system. So I think I'm not discounting it. I think it goes back to, when we first talked about the future of good, and I was like, the future of good is exploring new goods, new ideas of good, and codifying it to the point that it becomes incorporated into our economic thesis of what is good, and thereby becomes a new norm. So water utility is no longer an idea of a good, it's a utility. So how do you expand what is kind of a good idea and then turn it into a utility function of society? And I think we're living in that moment where I think the knowledge that already exists in the system to understand the expanded rationality and to expand what we perceive as morals, and I don't think they are, to incorporate them into utility. The evidence for that is already in the pipework. So we no longer have to rely on morality to make the case. I think there's sufficient evidence to make that case that we have to operationalize differently. Hence, we have to change the logics of our institutions, which are encoded with those historic theories of value, and expand their historic theories into a new theory of value. And that, to me, is a hyper-rational, the expansion of the rational landscape to encompass what is now a gap between what is the moral landscape and the known landscape of value. So, for example, I think what we saw in COVID was probably will have massive intergenerational trust breakdown issues. Right? So if you were trying to really think at a societal scale, what's the implication of that? The intergenerational trust that will start to break down as a result of that. You start to say, well, actually, is the state only really worried at fundamental levels, the economic functioning units of the state? Right? And that's who were protected and who were marginalized as costs or perceived direct costs were actually marginalized. So you start to say, well, actually, the state's functionality is limited into its tax base, and even its representation was not sufficient to be able to deal with it. So I think these are, if you're looking deep enough and caring deep enough into the system, you start to see what the crisis is that we're embedding right now into future relationships of, and the lesson will not be learned by you or me, the lesson will be learned by our kids, who will actually detach that relationship to say, hey, I just remember this, right? So where are the lessons being learned from the system? So I suppose my thesis, my hypothesis would be that the moral landscape is a framework for expanding our thesis of good, the morality of hugging and caring for a tree, right? But it's the duty of our rational landscape take that morality to understand its value at a system level and to be able to expand our institutional landscape to be able to encompass that value. That is a dialogue that we cannot rely. Morality will move 0.1% of the economy, right? It's our institutions that move trillions. And it's our institutional frames that are constructing our economy that's killing us, right? Those decisions that we made were made on types of balance sheet functions and risk functions and cost functions in a way. The Excel spreadsheet that constructed that is the problem. And as we change the Excel spreadsheet, we're still in the same problem landscape.
Right. I'm really curious about the new values that will start to emerge in the system, because I think we're and I don't know if we'll see.
Is it new values? Is it new values or value? Right, because values implies it's my value versus your value, right? I'm sort of really,
or could be like a plurality of values. Like I don't know if I see. Yeah.
Because I'm nervous of it becoming an identity-related theory of value, which is where this language often falls into. Your values versus mine, conservative values versus liberal values. I'm like, what the fuck? Right? These aren't the theory of value of society. What do we value as society, and how do we understand liabilities and risk? These are not political domain conversations. They're expansions of our.
But humans, we like people have proven over and over again that humans are not rational.
But our institutions are. But our institutions are.
Yeah, institutions are. but humans aren't. And so, and this is the really interesting challenge, right? Because we make decisions and choices based on the values that we have, and they come from different places, some of it is comes from our families, some of it comes from our peers, places we live, our professional lives, like all this type of stuff, right? So
yes, but let's keep going with this, right, for a moment, right? So, okay, so humans aren't rational systems, totally, but our institutions are, and we create. So the theory of law,
but they're created by humans.
Yeah, totally.
Institutions are created together.
But our theory of law is not a mechanism, not only a mechanism of control, but it's an invitation for ennoblement. So we create our institutions to invite us to be better humans. This isn't a linear pathway of like they're just mirror reflections from. They're actually invitations. Like you could say there are the constitutions, many when they were written, they were an invitation for us to be better. Right? So I think we have to start to see them as symbiotic development pathways as opposed to literal representations coding of our value. They're a developmental engine, they're a co-developmental engine. And they're not just mirror reflections of ourselves, because if they were, I think we would be doing what we've done. The fact that we as a society are able to do what we're able to do is because they're ennoblement mechanisms. They're mechanisms to make us better. There are synthetics to construct us to be better. And I think that's okay.
I think so too. But here's the thing. So yes to all of that, but I think because like even constitutions and laws, yes, invitation to be better humans. But what is better? Better according to whom? Better according to which group? Like these are like that comes down to values, right? And so
does it come down to values? Or does it come down to...
Well, it does, because like I mean, you could talk to any country in the world and say, listen, like, what are the set of values that your constitution stands for? And folks will give you an answer. So I think it actually does come down to values, because there are humans making these drafts and these laws and so on. And so yes, in theory, rational and invitation to be a better human. But the challenge for me, and this is the sort of the real nuance here, is better according to whom? Better according to whom? Because we have been down this path where certain types of people defined better, and that actually wasn't better. And so that's what I mean by some of the lock-in that we're facing.
So the invitation of better is, I think, an intrinsic invitation as opposed to an extrinsic invitation, firstly. So I think, and this is why I say the human development framework has to be at the center of any form of transition. Because I think if we're going to talk about democratic transitions, we're going to have to build the capacity for us to reimagine our own betters. And reimagine our own betters by re-understanding our own self. And only if you re-understand your own self and recognize that my interdependencies, Bayer says very elegantly, we don't have relationships, we are relationships. Understanding ourselves in a different way starts to reimagine our theory of how our relationship to values as a result of a new re-examination of ourselves. So I think this is a loop. I don't think this is a developmental loop, and it is a relational loop to the world. So for me, this isn't a case of defining good by third parties. It's the cognition to be able to reimagine good by myself. And building the capacity to be able to do that is going to be the foundation to be able to co-build institutions around us that enhance our own theories of good. So this is a mutual development exercise between human development and institutional frameworks, and it's a co-development engine. It can't be outsourced, it can't be represented, it's a developmental framework which both have to coexist on. So this isn't an imposition. Now, one thing I would say is, and I think this is going to be the slightly controversial bit, I increasingly think in terms of implicate order, right? And the sort of the order deep into our system, whether it's the biological systems, our quantum systems, these sort of orders are becoming more and more visible, and they're becoming more and more universal. But the implied order is going to be highly contingent, right? And highly specific and highly plural. So we're going to see sort of, rather than what I would say, modernism and its sort of universality of the implied order, we're going to see it go the other way, where the implicate order is going to become more and more universal, but the implied order will become much more diverse and which become much more pluralistic. But that's rooted in a different theory of our own relationship with self. It's no coincidence whether it's self-sovereign technologies and entangled thinking and indigenous thinking are converging into new forms of actually seeing the world through an agency, as opposed to assets and dead things. For me, that's not a coincidence. That's an emergent form relevant to our age that's coming to power as a way of seeing the world, and that invites this framework. So I don't know. I'm a little bit more. I don't want to, because my worry is we could let this go to morality. Then I don't have a frame to be able to say your morals versus my morals. Whose morals? Morals to do with what? We fall into that landscape.
Right.
And whereas a developmental relationship doesn't allow that us to fall into that space. And I think that's a key issue. Now, I'm no way discounting in that thesis is how do we build just platforms for that development landscape, right? So there's an injustice issue. But I think, as we spoke about when you were in London, how do we deal with the future and how do we deal with justice and how do we bring the two together is really critical. And currently, we can deal with justice, which is a net zero-sum game. So it's the distribution of the now versus the infinite possibility of the future. How do we bring these two games together, the infinite game and the kind of finite distribution game, into a new landscape and a new provision is going to be really critical to be able to make these sort of transitions. And I think that becomes really key.
Yeah. Indy, I wish we had an extra 3 hours here because it feels like we were even though it's been an hour and a half, we've just been warming up, but I think this is a really good note to wrap up on, and I'm really looking forward to the next part of this, because some of the things that we've just started to get into around justice and futures, I think that could be a really neat launch point to a whole bunch of other questions and conversations. So anyways, listen, as always, really pleasure to hang out and explore some of these really like multidimensional, difficult questions with you, and to hold the space to be able to do that, I think is quite extraordinary. And hopefully this has been enriching for you too. And so
totally. And I want to just thank you for being able to hold this space. Thank you for building Future of Good to be able to actually contain these sort of conversations. I think it is at this scale of conversations that we need to be engaging, and this and more by better people, because I think it's at the complexity of the intersection of these issues that the future is going to be constructed, and it can't be constructed by single domain or single perspective. So yeah, I really appreciate everything you're doing and everything you and your team are doing and be able to advance these futures. So thank you.
Right, thank you.